There are a number of reasons. I mean, pragmatically, Alfred North Whitehead says that all of Western philosophy is footnotes to Plato, and I think that might be going too far. But the general point is, there's a kernel of truth in his general point. The kernel of truth is that it's remarkable the extent to which the ancient Greeks set up the contours of contemporary thought, laid out the real possibilities of thinking. So things that were written off as absurd in the pre-Socratics, like the atomism of Democritus, right? It's absurd, and Aristotle in his physics writes it off, and 15 to 20 centuries later, more than 20 centuries later, scientists come around to an atomistic way of thinking, but it was already there. I mean, in broad outline, some of the crazy things that some of these pre-Socratics say, like Thales famously said that all is water, right? Well, it's a very difficult statement to understand, but when you look at contemporary string theory, you get this notion that there aren't, the number of elements are not fundamental elements, and not the elements on the periodic table that chemists use. In some sense, there's only one fundamental element, and it's strings. And then these other elements that chemists might study emerge from the behavior of these one-dimensional strings. I'm no scientist, so I'm not here to lecture anybody about how contemporary science views the world. But the basic point being that a huge array of possibilities, some of which might strike the modern ear as absurd, have already been staked out in the history of philosophy, and they're almost waiting for rediscovery, and very often they do get rediscovered. On the other side of this same pragmatic coin, why having a historical awareness is useful to the philosophers or to people interested in the nature of reality, is that they've also made a lot of mistakes in the past, right? Stuart Candlish, in one of his books on early analytical philosophy, talks about later analytical philosophers, so philosophers of the last 20 to 50 years, reinventing the square wheel rather than reinventing the wheel, right? Reinventing the wheel that doesn't work, because they're not historic, the philosophers he's talking about, he alleges, are not historically aware enough to recognize that they're walking into problematic areas that have already been walked into. Mistakes have already been made, and to be aware of these things helps us not to make the same mistakes again. But I'm not just a philosopher, I'm also a theologian, and I stand within a particular theological tradition. Now, if you believe in the existence of a personal God, and you believe in some sort of process of revelation, and obviously different religions and different churches within religions will differ as to how the mechanics of revelation work. But that's going to give another incentive to look carefully at the history of ideas. As an Orthodox Jew, I take it that God's revelation, the revelation of God's will, unfolds itself through the written scripture, the Old Testament of the Christian religion, what we would call the Hebrew Bible or the Tanakh, that God's revelation unfolds through that. But it doesn't end there, revelation for Orthodox Judaism, because God's will is also unfolding through rabbinic literature, the Talmud, the Midrash, the Agadah, and the history of Jewish ideas. So once a philosopher has in his back or her back pocket this thesis, this hypothesis, there's a God who exists, and this God has been communicating through a particular tradition, a literary or textual or religious tradition, then one has to be a little bit more sensitive to the history of the ideas or the tradition in which you stand. So I as an Orthodox Jew, I look to rabbinic literature to guide me as I create new philosophy. I look at it as reflecting the unfolding, though not unfinished, revelation of God's wisdom.